Okay, hello, welcome everyone today to this pedestrian hosted workshop, Rethinking Parking Spaces. This workshop is hosted by the Streets as Public Space Group, which is led by Montreal-based Zvi Leve. So we are going to be exploring many issues related to parking. This is the first parking related workshop for the network. So I'm excited to see how this rolls out. We have people from all over the world here, network participants. So this should be really exciting. Thank you, Zvi, for hosting this, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Annika. Do you pronounce it Annika or Annika?
Annika.
Okay. So hi, I'm Zvi Leve. I'm in Montreal. This initial workshop, at least, I just really want to hear, first of all, really understand how you interpret this concept of streets as public space and how you see the role of parking fitting into that. So I'm just sort of by way of an introduction, I came to discover my love for cities completely by chance many, many years ago. And that spurred me to go back to university, and I ended up doing my PhD research on using parking pricing policy as a tool to basically control travel demand. So that sort of was like what initially interested me. And during my studies, I eventually, I did my studies in Israel, and I met someone and fell in love and moved to Montreal, actually. So it's really been in Montreal where I've sort of refined this idea. Like, one of the things that really struck me when I moved here is that streets were really, there was lots of life in the streets here, like community things. Like anyone could basically open a street and have a party there. And that was a very normal thing. And so that really got me thinking about, who decides what we do in streets? How do we plan for it? In Montreal, we actually, for a long time, we've had terraces and things in the streets, and bike parking in the street is actually, since we launched the bike share system about a bit more than 10 years ago. They put the bike parking the bike share system in the streets, which I thought was actually like a really interesting idea. So they kept the pedestrian environment better, more cleared from bicycles and things like that. So today I'm curious to hear about, I don't think I've been in any of the places where any of you live. I have had the good fortune to travel quite a bit in the world, and I've seen how different cities work. And but this idea of public space in general, like, what is it? Who decides how we use it? How do we share that space? I mean, this is also like a big thing with streets. It's really, it's contested space. Like, multiple people want to use that space, and so this can often cause conflicts. And how do we negotiate those conflicts? So that's really what I hope to use this group to explore more, and hopefully we can find ways to, in all of our respective cities, to create better places for pedestrians, actually. That's really the end goal here. What I suggest we do, since I am the moderator, if anyone wants to, so at the moment we are, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6. We're 6 people, and we're going to have a little bit less than 90 minutes. So that's like up to 10 minutes or so per person, and maybe 5 minutes per question. If anybody wants to talk, wants to give a presentation, you can raise your hand, and I'll assume that person will be the next one in the list. Oh, we have another person. So the more people we have, the less time we will have. So the way I would like to sort of handle this, if anyone has any material they can show, they're more than welcome to share their screen and show a few things. But really, let's try and keep this, like the initial part at least, relatively short, so that we can all ask questions. And we'll try to keep each person to around 10 minutes per intervention. So is there anyone who wants to begin talking about their particular city? I don't see any hands up at the moment. Hold on. Okay. Niharika, would you like to begin? can't hear anything. Devanta, I know that, okay. Devanta, would you like to begin? Your connection seemed to be pretty good.
Yeah, I'm from Sri Lanka. Basically I live in two cities, in Colombo and Kandy. Kandy, I consider Kandy as my hometown because my home is there, but I work in Colombo, so most of the weekdays I spend in Colombo. In general, in Sri Lanka, I would say the built environment is like completely car auto-oriented. Like we have very few public transit options. So basically, we have like trains and buses. Buses, it's not even prioritized. It's like running mixed traffic. Trains, it's not available everywhere. So, and also the condition is not that good. It's not that reliable as well. So because of this reason, I mean, almost everyone who can afford a vehicle, buy a vehicle. So it doesn't have to be a car. It can be like even a scooter. Even, I mean, if you cannot afford a car, at least you buy a tuk-tuk or even like a scooter or something. I mean, people always like rarely rely on public transportation. So when I use public transportation to commute from my place to my work, most of the people ask like, why don't you buy a vehicle, or like I mean, it's like it's like a given you should buy some kind of a vehicle. So so it's not because of that there are a lot of parking spaces everywhere. So
there are a lot of parking spaces where?
Everywhere.
Okay.
So off-street parking and on-street parking.
Is on-street parking technically permitted, or is it sort of people just do it?
So it is permitted, but only in certain locations. So, but most of the time, those locations like fill up really quickly. So people also like park on sidewalks and all the unauthorized places. So to prevent that, I think now they're like even narrowing the sidewalks and allowing more parking areas. That's what they are doing as a solution instead of like improving public transportation or doing it instead of going in that direction. Like they are adding more and more parking spaces from the municipal side. So
the government is sort of funding, subsidizing the parking spaces, like
no,
building them themselves?
No, the building them themselves. They are fairly expensive, but people use it anyway because they don't have much other choices.
But it's the government who is building them?
Yeah.
These spaces? Okay. Because
not off street parking, but on streets.
Okay. And is there any kind of parking enforcement if somebody breaks the rules? Does anything happen?
No, not really. So this is interesting actually. So if there's a meter and you park next to that, so you add coins and they make the payments and you park there. And if you park it more than the given time, you get a ticket, right? But if you park it on a sidewalk or in an unauthorized area, there's almost no penalty because nobody's like watching the place. So it's kind of weird. And there's no towing, like they don't tow the cars. So people are not that afraid to park in unauthorized places.
Yeah, we have a similar sort of situation in Montreal where you can only ticket when they're breaking the official rules.
Yeah.
But if they're not, like, if there are no rules about that, like exactly what you said, if you park in front of somebody's house, for example, and block on their house, like it's not the public domain, it's not a parking space so they can't actually ticket you for that. It's like the person who lives there has to call and complain. so we have
but in Montreal, I think you have options, public transportation options, right?
We do, but parking is a really big, one of the things I didn't mention is we often we have like reserved bus lanes, and a lot of the challenges around parking and what we're doing is we're trying to create more space for people, like for bicycles and for buses and things like that. And whenever they want to put in create more space for these things, very often they take away the parking, or they want to take away the parking. And it's very, very hard from a political point of view to remove parking spaces. So even though we have a municipal government, which in theory wants to do this, it's very, very hard for them politically. Like a street near me, just literally a week ago, they wanted to put in wider cycle paths for a long time. And sometimes what we do when they want to do that is they'll convert a street into one way. Like they'll take a traffic lane and they'll put cycle paths on each side of the street. So the street will become, instead of being two ways, it will become one way, and they'll keep the parking on both sides. In this
One way
particular
with one lane, or
yes, there'll be one traffic lane, but the bicycles will have a separate path on each side. So the bicycles can go both ways, but the cars can only go one way. So that's something we do fairly commonly here, which is usually works rather well. And it's easier to keep the parking than it is to take away the traffic lane. So, but there's a street closer to me where they actually, it was important to keep the traffic two ways. So they removed, it took them a long time, but they took away 600 parking spaces and made a bicycle path on each side. So the cars can still go both ways, but there's only parking on one side now. And but these kind of changes are very, very challenging for the city to do, and they're very afraid to do them. Like in the area where I live, there's actually like a very, very progressive government, and even here, they're very afraid to remove parking, or to say that they'll remove parking. So this is really one of the struggles that we have, is how can we create more space. Mohammed, did you want to ask a question, or did you want to present next?
No, I'm gonna ask a question, because you said majority of removing parking lanes, parking spaces. So what do people believe, and don't they neglect it? Because what I see in my country is so different. They not support any cycle lane.
So what was your question?
Okay, do I have any problem with the sounds?
No. I did not. I heard what you said, but I did not understand the question.
Okay. So I said, you said that in the region you're living, okay, the government removes the parking lanes and put some cycle lanes, okay. So
yes,
okay, but it's really different in my country. When someone do that, I mean the authorities do that, people are neglecting it. People say that there is not enough parking spaces for our cars. What about this issue in your regions?
It's the same.
Okay.
and it's very hard. Like people will always complain, especially the store owners. Actually, they always say that people need to have parking to come to their store. And also this is the cars parking in the bike lanes or the bus lanes is still a problem.
I see.
And especially for the bus, like we have or they're called like express rapid transit lanes to allow the buses to not be stuck in traffic, because the buses, if it's stuck in traffic, it goes very slow. So they try to take the parking and let the bus go there. But like one car can block the bus, basically.
I see.
So
yeah, common issue here.
Yeah. So we are still struggling with this. We're trying to find better solutions, and but it's hard. But I mean, yeah, it's hard. It's hard here, and I'm sure it's even harder, especially in developing countries where people are acquiring cars very quickly. So the level of motorization is changing very rapidly, and government is trying to accommodate that very quickly. Hold on, Arshel, did you have a question as well before I go to Divanta?
Not exactly a question, but actually I just wanted to speak to you. But then, yeah, carry on, Divanta. I'll ask you later.
Okay, Divanta?
Yeah, so what kind of solutions you already use? What kind of strategies you already use to like prevent those kind of violation of laws?
Well,
other than like fining the...
it's a challenge. Like we actually are our parking authority in Montreal. What we used to be responsible for enforcing the parking tickets in the pay parking, now is called the Sustainable Mobility Agency. So they've sort of like rethinking, and their mandate now is to rethink the curb space. But it's a relatively new agency, and they're still, trying to figure out how exactly they're going to what is their mandate and how they're going to apply it. One of the things that they do is they have a special unit which really goes out when cars are obstructing circulation in some places, so they can be very quickly proactive, especially also around construction sites, for example. Like construction sites also often block the road and bicycle parking and pedestrian things. So they have a unit dedicated to that. They're starting to have a unit, like we're doing a lot of these cycle paths now. Well, I wouldn't say we're doing much more than we used to. And it's a really big problem with the cars parking in them. Like, especially like right at the beginning when they first launch it, basically the cars keep parking in there all the time. So they really need to be very proactive. They need to give tickets very often. I don't know if they tow cars yet, but they try to be, but I mean, like the city is quite big and they can't be everywhere all at the same time. I saw in New York City, actually, they just changed the law. So citizens can actually report a car blocking a bike lane. And if they take a picture of the license plate and things, the city will ticket the car, and the citizen who reported it will actually make a little bit of money. So this is something we can't do.
That's a creative solution.
Mohammed, did you want to say something more?
Nothing. Just what you say about New York is my passion. I also developed in something like a new idea about it in my country, but it's really great. I guess to make money. Yes.
Well, and in New York, I mean, it's actually been quite a long time where a big part of the problem was the people who would give the parking tickets, they didn't really have the authority to do anything other than give a parking ticket for if you didn't pay to be in a paid parking place. So in New York, some time ago, they changed the law to give these people a little bit more authority. And I think New York was very revolutionary in that. In Montreal, for example, the people who give the parking tickets, like I said, they can't really ticket you if you're not they can only ticket you for breaking the law relative to the paid parking places. They can't really give you a ticket for anything else. Like that, you need a regular police to do that. So, okay, is there any more questions about the situation? So another question, Sri Lanka, do you have like, do people sell things in the streets? Like, do you have like little terraces and things that like pop up? Like, do people who are selling, I don't know, sort of things, is that something that is used in the street base or not so much?
In Sri Lanka, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah.
no, not on the road, but they use sidewalk instead. So
okay,
that's actually even worse because they are taking over the pedestrian space, but they instead of like using the vehicle space.
Okay. So Arshel, did you want to present your situation next?
I just have joined recently, last week to be precise. I am from Guwahati, from northeastern part of India. It's what we call a tier 2 city. The population is about 1.5 million. The size of the city is about 368 square kilometers. And it is one of the top 100 most polluted cities in the world.
So you have industry or things there? Where does the pollution come from?
Not exactly. Industries are not inside the city, outside. We have this pollution control board in that's a government agency, but then we don't have this source apportionment technique whereby we are not able to find out which actually is the source of this pollution.
Yeah.
Right? The PM 2.5 levels, as per WHO, are 5 times more. But in India, the government follows a less stringent this thing. The PM 2.5 levels that is considered is harmful is less than the WHO standards in India. But that's another factor when I come to about parking and all. In Guwahati, there is this Guwahati Municipal Corporation, which actually has designated 53 areas, which are a mix of on-street parking, off-street and multi-level parking. Some of the places are like below flyovers. Among the 53 spots, only 10 are paid. The other 43 are free. Actually, earlier, most of these were free. Last year, actually, something happened. These actually spaces are leased out to some smaller organizations to collect the parking fee. But then due to some issues, it was found out that there are a lot of massive corruption out there. These spaces were leased out to lessees and they used to quote some funds and all. So massive corruption happened, though all these spaces were made free. And last year, we also had the EV policy, state EV policy. So to encourage more people to buy electric vehicles, they have said that anybody who has an electric vehicle will be able to get free parking for next 3 years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Lots of places are doing that kind of thing.
Yes.
A question.
Yeah,
in your city, are there motorbikes or cars? Like, what is the proportion of traffic which is in cars versus motorbikes?
The mode share as of the last census in India was held in 2011. Right. Okay. So mode share is of 2011. So at the time we had about 21% of the working population was walking, 21% were cycling. I mean 42% were NMT.
Okay.
Right. So about 12% were private cars, 8% was public vehicles. Okay. Majority, in fact, a majority of the cities in India have motorbikes.
Yeah. So they were almost 40% was motorbikes. Basically,
less than that, I guess. I forgot the actual figures. Basically, since I just forgot to give a brief introduction about me actually. Yeah. Give me just a minute. So I don't have a technical background in architecture and all those. I basically have an experience in banking. I left my job about 10 years back. I had some failed entrepreneurial ventures. 2016, I got into cycling as a recreation. 2018, I became the bicycle mayor of Guwahati.
Okay.
I think most of the people, yeah. So I got into cycling primarily as I get to get more people into cycling. The more I got into it, I realized that the government will not only focus on cycling. It has to be multimodal. So going ahead, three of my friends, we formed this organization called, initially it was called Pedal for a Change, basically to promote cycling. We used to do all kinds of events and all. 2020, we started this organization called, initially it was Green and Guwahati Active Mobility Forum. Now it is Green and Active Mobility Forum, whereby we have a different set of people. One is like, just like I'm the mayor, I get to select we get to select some people who represent the wards. We call them bicycle councillors as of now. Probably we'll change it to active mobility councillors. So these people are like helping out to reach out to more places. And again, we have some technical advisors from across the city from different specific areas. Some are professors in transportation. Some of the members are urban planners and transport planners. So these people actually help me out, like help not only the whole organization to talk about, take this process forward. So we are basically a active citizens group and doing some advocacy work, do some small research work exactly. But then again, we are bootstrapped, no funding as such. It is basically passion driving us. But I realized that it's not just about cycling that we need to talk about. We have to talk about walking as well. Nobody was doing that. And when I came to know about pedestrian space, I joined up. So
and where does parking fit into these conversations? Is anybody talking about parking?
We have started this discussion here actually, because again, letting go one more thing. Yes, I am actually also currently student of public policy. through public policy, I came to know about that road spaces are actually common goods, right? So these are common goods that the government actually needs to commercialize and earn money out of it. They're just giving out free, right? So I came to, this is a learning, I mean, still in a learning phase, all these things. So I also came to know about this thing recently, actually last month. There have been talks about removing or lessening the amount of parking spaces in the city. So a lot of commercial establishments which have their shops near the streets have been complaining that they need the parking spaces to be there so that they get more customers. So these are the problems that we're facing. But then again, it's a mix of things. We also, like in India, it's a developing country, we tend to follow whatever has followed in the Western countries in the last 50 years, like the idea of creating lots of flyovers and widening the roads is the solution that most people think about. And the parking is like, the major problem I have found out is that the people who are vocal, who have the means to reach out to the authorities through whatever means like social media or other media, are vocal about these are the people who own the vehicles. And they demand parking spaces, they demand wider routes. And last year, this survey was made in India, All India survey, government survey. It was found out that in the state I belong to, only 8% of the families own a vehicle. About 70% of people own bicycles. But then the whole development model is skewed. I think it's the same way everywhere.
Well, yes, it's similar, but with slight differences. And there's also, I mean, I think every country aspires to be developed, more developed, and in a lot of South Asian countries, sort of their perception of being developed is owning a car. So like we actually, in Montreal, we actually, it's a challenge. People who come from these regions of the world, when they come to Montreal, like they consider, okay, they're a success. They actually, they succeeded in leaving the poverty of their original country, as they consider it. And now they're in a Western country, so they must be basically a success. So for them, imagining to ride a bicycle, they associate that with poverty. So even though like riding a bicycle in Montreal may be very, very practical, they would never do it, because that would be sort of admitting that they are poor. Like my neighbor across the street, actually, he's from Pakistan, but he lived in Berlin for many years, and he rides a bike. But his younger brother now, who came to live with him, came straight from Pakistan, and he's like, he sees his brother riding a bike. He's like, "Are you poor?" Like, I'm not poor. So it's very interesting. Devanta, did you want to add something?
Yeah, no, I had a question for the Asher. So I was wondering, how is the public transportation in your city? Because I mean, most of the South Asian countries I see, like the biggest reason is like they don't have alternatives. So anyway, you have to use some kind of private mode. So
in Guwahati, as per the last census, 8% of the people used to use public transportation. Recently, after the electric vehicle policy was passed,
8, right?
8%. 8.
Oh, okay.
0.
What are the options that you have though? Are they buses? Are they
buses? And we also have the shared taxis and shared autos. The tuk-tuks that you see here, we call it auto rickshaws. And
public transportation, like the buses, trains, do they have?
No, we don't have trains, local trains or metro here. There are talks for metro here. But then again, there are some issues, like there's a thing called a concept called comprehensive mobility plan, which was passed last year, but the government has not yet made it public. I happened to, through my sources, got to see it, and it was deplorable. And recently I got to meet the agency head who actually was in charge of getting this thing. I called him, I met him and said, "Sir, why haven't you made this document public?" Even though it's not a policy document, that's a vision document. That's how the state government follows to develop the mobility plan of the city. And they state that the state political head, that's what we call the chief minister, is not happy with the previous comprehensive mobility plan. He wants to change. So basically, just give me, if you give me 2 minutes, I'll just explain. In the state of in India, like having a metro is again an aspirational thing, even though as per a metro policy and all, most of the cities do not need to have metro. It's quite expensive thing.
Yeah.
Right. But then every city, every politician like promises to have a metro. In like city of Guwahati, the idea, I think the foundation stone was laid about more than a decade back. But it was not, the process was not followed. The comprehensive mobility plan was not there. They got it done. But the basic idea of having the comprehensive mobility plan was to get the metro in place. And funnily, the comprehensive mobility plan suggested only 2 tracks, whereas the politicians wanted 8 lanes. So that's how the politicians were not happy with the whole comprehensive mobility plan suggestions. They didn't make it public, wanted to renew it again. So that's the things, all this politics goes on in the state. Again, coming back to public transportation, one good thing happened is that after the after the EV policy was passed, the government has actually purchased 300 electric buses and 100 CNG buses to be applied inside the city. But the problem I see is that there is no route rationalization, and there is no way that the government is trying to discourage people from riding their cars, even though the public in large thinks that if there are more buses, there will be more congestion. The public in large are actually basically against buses. They prefer more private vehicles.
That's very interesting. One thing I've noted here in Montreal is there's a strong interest in having rail solutions, usually underground or overground. And I think that one of the reasons that the politicians like such solutions is because it doesn't remove parking. Like when the buses are often stuck in traffic, and parking is like something that could be removed. To like, if the bus is not fast, it's not really going to be a good option for people. Like, we really need things that are competitive, at least similar speeds to cars, if not ideally much faster even. I see we have a few new people dropped in, Raphael and Dominique. What we're doing is basically sort of presenting, each person is presenting where they live, where they're from, if there's a specific project, and we're having a conversation around that. And we have around 45 minutes left. So we've done 3 people now. Would either of you like to present your city or location? Raphael, would you like to present?
Right. I'm based in Stockholm, Sweden, although I'm actually traveling, and I'm right now in Zurich.
And is there anything you've noticed the parking differences between those places? Or
well, I've been in Zurich for like only a day or 2, and so far I couldn't really notice any notice much difference. But it seems like or I should put a metro like that, like both Stockholm and Zurich. Like a lot of people do drive, but I think in downtown Zurich seems to be having a less of a parking on the street problem than Stockholm. As in, I don't see that much cars parking on the street in Zurich compared to Stockholm.
so I think in general in Europe, parking on the street, like I think the general law is you're only allowed to park where it's permitted. Mm-hmm. So like by default on roads, it's actually not permitted. Whereas in many other places, it's sort of the opposite. You can park anywhere except where it says you're not allowed to. So it's sort of like a different, in Europe, it's really, you can only park where you are allowed to. And the fines that they will like put the boot on your car and tow it very quickly. And it's very expensive if you park illegally. And whereas in other places, the fines are, especially if you're a wealthy person, like the fines are really, like, they really mean nothing. Right. Jivanta, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and Rafael, I was wondering, like, I I watch a lot of like walking videos in cities, like especially in Stockholm. I see a lot of they have put like a lot of parklets in parking areas, like more recently. Is that like a more common in Sweden or in Stockholm or?
Right. I think it's increasingly common in like a lot of Swedish cities. Yeah, and I've also seen those for example, in Helsingborg on the south side of the country as well. I think like municipalities in Sweden are pretty active in like trying to make small changes to public spaces one at a time.
How is the pricing like on street parking?
Right. For example, in Stockholm, they do it in rings. For example, the inner ring, they put it pretty expensive. Like you're gonna get charged like I don't really remember, like, but it's pretty expensive, like $5, $10 an hour, or even more. I think it's but outside it could be pretty cheap.
And one of the things I remember from Stockholm is many of the pedestrian streets where they were pedestrian only during certain times of day, like between 10 in the morning, maybe and 8 in the evening. And then afterwards, cars would be allowed to go back into that space. And I thought that was a very interesting idea that we don't see very often in Montreal, for example. So it's either a pedestrian street or it's not. Whereas this sort of hybrid that depends on the time of day, I thought was a very good idea. Arsha, did you have a question?
The question is actually you for Zvi. Just
can't hear you.
trying to understand. Yeah, in the city I belong to, there are a lot of commercial buildings like malls and all those properties. They used to charge the customers who used to visit the places to park their vehicles. So last year, the corporation made a rule that these establishments, private establishments, cannot charge the customers. They have to made it available, the spaces for free. So
Really?
what do you think of this? Is it right way to go ahead or like?
I think that the government should not be getting involved. If the private sector thinks it's charging people to use the spaces and there is a good way to sort of allocate how long people stay and use it, I think the government should not be telling them not to do it.
I think free parking is worse, like encouraging you to like use.
Yeah, it's terrible.
But in his case, like anyway, there's no other alternative. So, I mean, so.
I also believe that the government should get in the private space. One more question, if you allow me, I can comment later on as well. I'll let the other speakers speak first. We'll come later on.
What is it to something we've been speaking to already? Your question?
It is related to all these things, but then I'll come later on. I will not take much of the time. Let the other speakers speak as well.
Okay. Rafael, did you have anything more to add?
Right. Like regarding parking, like finding interesting because like in Stockholm there's a political focus on like trying to get people to cycle and walk, which is good, and I don't see that kind of stigma that you mentioned here for cycling, at least. But it's like because in Stockholm, the politics are really pretty split, with like the richer suburbs tend to be more conservative and they push for like more roads, parking. And then there are also a lot of neighborhoods on geographically and other side, like they want better transit, free transit. And I can see the kind of tension here happening in the politics of Stockholm.
Okay. Another thing which I believe they do at least in Zurich, I'm not sure about other cities in Sweden, they actually have a very good inventory of how much parking they have. Like the city actually knows how much parking they have, which is quite rare in most locations. And they actually have rules. They are not adding, you cannot add more parking. Like if you build a new development, if you add parking to your new development, that means the city is actually going to remove on-street parking from other places. So like they sort of made a policy decision that we are no longer adding more parking spaces. And they actually like enforce that by removing the ones on the public domain, which I think is a great idea. And Copenhagen as well, I know they had a policy to every year reduce the parking spaces on the public domain. Like these are things that government, in my opinion, we shouldn't be providing parking on the public domain. Like if there's a need for it, and clearly there is, it's not government's job to respond to that need. Like it's like they shouldn't get in the way of letting the private sector or other people like provide us options, but it's not really the government's job to find a parking place for people. Mohammed, did you want to ask something?
You mean me?
Yes, I thought I saw your hand.
No, it was not time. But you said the private sector, the government sector. It's been really different in my country. The government is at the helm of everything. They should provide parking for everyone, I guess. Yeah, so many different things I'm listening. So that's shocking.
Well, I think it's common in many places that the government is very involved in this sector, and they make rules actually that you have to provide parking whenever you build a new building and things. So at least in the US, there are rules like when you open a store, like depending on how big your store is, you have to provide parking, and the government says you have to provide parking.
Yes, so same here.
Okay, so in my opinion, these are very bad rules. Like the government shouldn't be telling people how much parking to provide, and ideally, like in my I have this idea of what I call community parking, which is another way of managing parking completely. It's not government, it's not private, it's something else. So maybe Iran would be the perfect place for that, because the Iranian Revolution originally was supposed to be a third way as well. So it's like not American, not communist, it's just something else. So, so maybe you will come around to that as well. Okay, are there more questions? Rafael, did you have something more to add?
Right. You just mentioned about parking standards, which is an interesting question because I see a lot of discussion going on in the US regarding abolishing parking minimums. And in fact, when I was in grad school in Hong Kong, like the standard there still has parking minimums, which we learned as a matter of rules. And like, I feel like it can be pretty hard to abolish those standards, but I can feel like there's a shift going on towards abolishing those minimums.
Yes, Devanta.
Yeah, I was curious, like in Stockholm and in Montreal, do you have also parking minimums?
Parking what?
Minimum parking requirements in Montreal and in Stockholm?
In Montreal, it's changing. It's usually managed at the borough level, and there's more and more boroughs that no longer have minimums. And in fact, they're introducing minimums for bicycle parking. Like you don't have to provide any car parking, but you do have to provide a certain amount of bicycle parking. And which is, I mean, this is actually an important issue that we're not talking about today, at least. But parking for bicycles is just as important as parking for cars. And so this is really something that we all too often do not think about, and it's just as important an issue. And what's happening in Montreal, though, is because there are no longer parking minimums, we're actually creating more problems on the public domain. Like, yes, we're building new developments with no parking, but we're not really making the access to these areas very comfortable. Like, we still haven't made the pedestrian access very, very comfortable. So the people who are living there do own cars, and they don't have anywhere to park them. And they're like, we're adding a growing, like usually these are in areas that used to be sort of industrial and had rail access, and now they're sort of being transformed into more upscale residential type areas. And the number of cars is growing very rapidly. But the parking options there aren't any parking options. Like before in the past, nobody lived there. So it really wasn't a problem. But now you have thousands.
Yeah, if I understood that correctly, like basically you're saying they don't have, a lot of places don't have parking, but at the same time they don't have other mobility options either, right?
Well, they should. I'm thinking of a few areas in particular that are often quite close to metro stations. So they really should have better public transportation options. But for a variety of reasons, the walking environment is not very good. And like getting to the metro station often involves crossing, like sometimes there's a rail track, which is actually a barrier, like you cannot cross it by foot. So there are some barriers around these areas that we haven't figured out how to make them more better accessible. And so like right now the city's approach is sort of like, okay, there are no parking minimums, but we're just not thinking about parking. Like there's another new development as well. Like it's going to be a few thousand people are going to live there, and the city is requiring them to only have 200 parking spaces, like one parking space for three residential units is fine, but like it's in an area, once again, it's near a rail station, but not that close. And it's surrounded by developments which have a lot of cars already. So the neighbors are really worried that this new development is actually going to cause parking problems for them. And so like in my sort of perception is we need to think about parking much more systematically. Like we need to think beyond just saying there's a minimum number. We need to actually create incentives to do things differently, ideally to separate the parking from, like, one of the problems with making it required is it's included in the cost of the house. Like you're basically making the condo or whatever more expensive if there's parking there. So it's not necessarily affordable for low income people. And I think we need to sort of find a way to sort of break this cycle of auto dependence.
So I was wondering, like, one more question, if I may. I was wondering, like, if they put more pedestrian access and good access to public transportation, in your experience, is that going to help with the situation? Because, I mean, people can switch from private vehicles to that.
It certainly should, and I mean, Montreal does have one of the highest levels of public transportation use in North America already. And it's really because we have a very comfortable urban scale. Like the scale of the development here is such that walking and riding a bike are very natural things to do. So even though we have winter, like people, even in the winter, people still walk and even ride bikes actually. And we do clear the sidewalks. Like we get a lot of snow, so we have to clear the snow. Like then we prioritize clearing the sidewalks before we clear the roads. So like in keeping the public transportation running. So it certainly could make, but despite all of that, like the car ownership levels are going up. Like it used to be historically in Montreal, we were much below the North American averages, and we are catching up. We're almost at the same level as elsewhere in North America. So, Arshad, did you have a question?
Yeah, not directly related to parking, but as we know, all these things are related. It's related to transportation, basically. In our country, basically, the government decides on the fare that any private vehicle operator, as a bus operator, there are a lot of private bus operators, a lot of tuk-tuk operators here, right? So the government decides on that. In fact, yesterday actually, there was this you must be aware of the city called Bangalore, right? So in the Bangalore, we have these companies like Uber and Ola, like, and there's another operator called Rapido, who basically rents out motorbikes. So they have been charged with over motorbikes.
They rent them, or they provide like a.
No,
are they like
provide the back seat. You can just use.
Okay.
So they have been accused of overcharging customers and they have been asked to reduce the charges. Right? Another thing, when I come to my city or any other city in India, the buses, even though these are public transportation, a lot of these are operated by private parties, and the government decides on the fare, even for the tuk-tuks and all. How I see it is that when the government decides on this, it is not profitable for them. And the whole venture is like they tend to go slow, they're not fast enough. So how do you look at, how do you think this can be solved? Should the government totally give it? I don't understand I'm not able to understand. Does the government need to decide on the fares
fares?
of, yeah.
Well, usually, at least in North America and Europe, the governments also subsidize public transportation. Like, we recognize that it's very rare that it can support itself, and it's a public good. So governments actually subsidize the agencies, and that's sort of what keeps the fares down lower. And the government, and there's a growing movement actually demanding free fare, like no fare at all, which I personally don't think that's necessarily a good idea. I'm not sure in India, I suspect the government probably does not subsidize very much public transport. So I think it's more problematic for them. You know, if you don't provide an incentive directly, then it's a little bit hard telling a private entity how they should be managing their affairs. I think that's a bit more of a challenge. But coming back to parking, what's interesting about the parking is it sort of gets in the way of all these things. Like, in order for public transportation to be effective, it needs to be able to run. And parking very, very often is blocking these vehicles. Like, I mean, I have been to Lahore, like I saw how the traffic on the streets works or doesn't work there. And I know in a lot of Asian cities, it's similar, where you have, you know, this crazy mess of all kinds of vehicles, and it's very, very hard to move at all. So, and parking just, I think, makes that even worse. Like, it makes it complicated. So, like, I see sort of parking as something that if we could not only like I've come to my perception is that it's not only about pricing parking, it's about the physically using it on the public space. Like when a car is there, or even a motorbike, when anything is blocking that space, they're interfering with other things. So the question is, you know, who has priority to that space and why? And when we're trying to promote public transportation, I think it's really important that we need to give it priority. In fact, like, if you want people to use the buses actually need to be able to go faster than the other vehicles. And that, in a way, is sort of the way I see government's role, is to assure that the right of way is maintained. Like, that's what I think government's role really is more important, is to define who has the right of way and how we should maintain that. Rafael?
Right. Responding to Devan's question, because I forgot his name. He also asked about Stockholm. I just checked that Stockholm still has a parking minimum, but they put it as a range, and that the Stockholm standard today is now 0.3 to 0.6 parking spaces for every housing unit. And also, one interesting thing about parking in Stockholm.
Sorry, how much? 0.3
to 0.6 for every housing unit.
Even in the city?
Yes, it's in general. Yes. And another interesting thing about Stockholm also has a lot of underground parking, like in other cities. But one interesting thing is that these underground parking can be converted to any other use as the owner sees fit. For example, to bombing shelters, which is most common for underground spaces anyway. And right, and also. Yes, and in Stockholm,
how common is underground parking in the Stockholm area? Like, do most people park in the underground spaces?
Quite a bit. I would say not really, especially many, but there are some.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were there any more questions about that?
Yes. Now I have a question. And in my point of view, I'm not really strict about the numbers of parking. Minimum parking spots for each unit of residential areas. I think that we should ask why you use a car instead of providing parking. And after we find out the reason why an individual use a car, we can add this to parking spaces, add this how to mitigate the use of car.
Well, typically people use car because their other options are not good enough. And don't forget, like a car is parked, like usually is essentially like 95% of the time, but it's not only parked at home, it's parked elsewhere as well. So for every car that you have, 4 or 5, or even in many American cities, up to 10 parking spaces for every car, because it needs to go at the different destinations as well. So it's very, the more parking that's available, the more attractive using the car will be. And if there's nowhere to park a car, you're not going to use it. Like, I think that's a very important thing to remember. And but it's the challenge is we've been building, like, basically car-oriented development is what has been considered, development for the last 50 plus years everywhere in the world. Like everywhere in the world has sort of adopted sort of American style of development pattern. And
No, I can understand why people are obsessed with cars. I'm also obsessed using car too, but yeah, I don't know what to say.
so, I mean, it's especially tragic in places that actually had rail, like many places where the British, particularly the British, built rail networks everywhere. And they had very extensive rail systems that worked quite well. Like in many Indian cities, like the number of people who use rail transport is crazy. Like every day, like in Mumbai, I mean, there's millions and millions of people who travel by rail. Dominic, did you want to add something?
Yeah. So hi everyone. Sorry for coming in late. My name is Dominic. I'm from Saskatoon, Canada. And I just woke up and I realized that we have a roundtable today. So yeah, I quickly joined and I want to join into the conversation about rail travel in here. So the fundamental rail travel problem with Canadian cities, many Canadian cities, aside from those big cities like Toronto, Montreal, or Vancouver, where the train station is located in their downtown, so they can just like go everywhere they need to go. Another fundamental problem with rail travels in the prairies is that the train stations are located in the industrial areas because they share the tracks with CN, the passenger rail company, Via Rail. They share the track with CN Rail. So they basically have to put their station in their industrial areas, and because transit service are not really adequate and frequent in industrial areas, like for example in Saskatoon, they only work during rush hour.
Yeah. So okay, but
yeah, so that means
is
like
important. But we're trying to talk about parking though. How is parking in Saskatoon?
We actually have a very interesting conversation just a few days ago with the city council member about the new arena in Saskatoon. They said that like the fundamental, like people have been screaming at the city for building a new arena because parking is obsolete in downtown, despite we have 13,000 parking spots for neighbors. So downtown Saskatoon has about 10,000 residents, but it has 13,000 parking spots. That means the number of parking spots also more than the number of people. That means the parking's like the space dedicated for parking in our downtown is really dead in our city. But people are still complaining that building a new entertainment and cultural exchange district will add more people to it. That means we need more parking space. But the problem is that like transit is so obsolete. That means transit is also very poor and not adequate. That means everybody have to drive. But if we think in a way that create better transit connections to and from downtown and between neighborhoods, then people don't have to drive and find a parking spot. Also, there are lots of like minimum parking requirements, basically like in every new neighborhoods of Saskatoon now. Like even for residential parking, a household now requires 3 parking spots. That means their garages have to be double garage, and they need to have enough space for 2 more cars to park on the street.
Wow. And Saskatoon is a relatively small city, although like in terms of population, I'm not sure what the area is. It might be a big area.
Yeah, we have like a huge problem with urban sprawl as well. We only have 300, like according to the new census, it's about 327,000 people in the entire census metropolitan areas. That means like we're combining other satellite cities together. But the vast majority of the residents drive. I think like 86% of the population commute to work using an automobile, either as a driver or as a passenger.
Okay. Devante, you had a question?
Yeah, so I was wondering, how is the situation changing? Like, is the authorities actively try to change the situation, or like, oh, they still rely on car infrastructure and going that way?
So we do have a BRT project that is set to launch in 2026. However, the progress of constructing it is pretty slow right now. We actually had to start construction 3 months ago, but so far nothing had been laid. And then we don't have, so far there had not been any like solid plans to do redevelopment on the corridors along the BRT. So the problem with our BRT right now is that like it runs on the main roads of the cities, like main arterial roads, but those arterial roads are also filled with lots of parking lots and big box stores.
Mhm.
So they really need to do a redevelopment on those arterial roads as well, because like when you get off the bus, you still have to cross gigantic parking lots to get to the stores. So what's the point of taking transit anyways if it's not welcoming and it's uncomfortable?
Is
And
that
parking
happening? Is there any kind of redevelopment going on?
There had not been a lot of talk about that, which is why when attending the city council meeting the other day, I really advocate for that. I really like mentioned that and really hope that like somebody would listen and take that into account in the future.
I mean, it sounds like you could transform the parking into a new development, like with an interior courtyard, like have development which would face the arterial instead of being,
Yep.
And I don't know where to start, and perhaps you need to align the property taxes. Like one of the things is often parking, they don't pay a very high property tax, so they don't have a very high incentive for that.
And the problem with parking in Saskatoon is that like they are at a very low cost. I don't know about Montreal, but our parking fees is $2 an hour. And if you pay $12, you can park for the whole day. And if
Even
you pay
in the on-street?
Yeah, even in the
Okay.
on-street. And I think there's also monthly parking passes for I think $120, which is just $30 cheaper than a monthly bus pass of $90.
Wow. Okay. Arshel, you had a question? We can't hear you.
I'm audible now?
No, it's okay.
Yeah. We have this organization, what we already mentioned. So we've been thinking about this idea to propose the government to come up with a parking policy for a state. So what do you think are the few basic ideas that you need to, basic areas we need to focus on that you think are like very general in purpose? Obviously, I know we'll have to be specific for a city as well, but some things are, I think, very general.
Well, I think it's a great idea to have a parking policy at the state level. And I think the place to begin with to have an inventory of how much surface parking, like the big parking lots, like in North America, the development pattern is sort of regional malls, like that are outside of cities, that are surrounded with literally tens of thousands of parking spaces. I don't know if you have such development in India yet, but just to have an inventory of how much parking you have.
This pattern that you follow.
Okay, so just to know how many parking spaces you have in a given area, and I would like for the government to actually put a tax on that space and use that money to subsidize public transportation. So like one of the challenges we have is cities are competing with these big outside of like these shopping centers that are outside of cities that can give the free parking very easily. They often they locate near highway interchanges and things like that, so they have very good car access. So it's really difficult for places in an urban context where there's lots of congestion and complicated travel to compete with that. So yeah, like I call it an unfair competition in a way. So I think to sort of compensate for that kind of development, we should be charging for the service. Like there is a cost, even though there's no building there, like allowing cars to park there is creating more needs and more infrastructure needs, and it would be better to develop in a different way. So like if they densified that area and maybe made it more accessible by public transportation, like they would actually perhaps, when they would be creating more value, like parking doesn't really create value directly, at least. It's the other activities that create the value. So I think we need some sort of mechanism to basically compensate for this sort of disfavorable condition between areas that are outside of cities competing with areas that are within cities. And that needs to be at the national level. Like a city can only control what's inside the city. They can't control what's outside of the city. So this is a big challenge, even here in North America. So I think that would be like, so I think a state level parking policy would be a great thing. And the place to begin is how much parking is actually there. And would it be possible to create a mechanism where the people who own it have to pay tax exactly on that? And that money would be dedicated to public transportation at the regional level as well. Mohammed, do you want to ask something?
Yes, I heard that one of you says it's kind of, I assume that the whole city is an area that you have to pay for parking. So, which is not in my country. Like, of course, in some major streets where the cops are going down the streets and with the cameras on the cars, and scan each car, and after 1 hour they come back and scan this car again, and if you stay there you have to pay the fine. I don't know where that money goes, but mainly people in my country park anywhere they want, sidewalks, in block a line, cycle lane, in front of a bridge, and so on. And everyone, please, I have to say that the drivers are rude, really. If they block your way, for instance, the parking door of your residential house, they are rude. They said that I park here just for 5 minutes, but it's not like that. It's exactly park an hour. And yeah, and of course, one interesting thing I remember when I was, I guess, doing my high school, I remember some businesses sold parking spaces. They blocked that space and said to drivers, if you wish to park here, you have to pay me. Then you can park here, which is really ridiculous. You have to ask who are you and who gives you that authorization to you have it is kind of your property, that parking space. Yeah. Why is it doing people something? Yeah, do the same right now.
Yeah, well, it's a very big challenge, what you were saying, this sort of culture of parking everywhere. And I think it's really, I think in Europe, the sort of reflex is parking is prohibited everywhere except where it's allowed. Whereas in most of the places, it's the opposite sort of idea, where parking is tolerated, except in specific areas where there are specific laws against it. And I mean, how do we change this perception? I really don't know. Like, but like I know in Europe, like if you were parked illegally, like it can be incredibly expensive. Like if they tow your car, like literally you pay by the hour until you get your car back. Like a friend had his car towed in Madrid. It was like 50 euros per hour until he went to get the car back. Like if you don't get your car back in a day or two, like you're just not getting it back at all. so they're very, very serious about these kind of fines in Europe. Whereas most other countries, unfortunately, they don't even have the tools to really apply that. Like even in China, I remember when I was there and I noticed some cars were parking wherever. And I actually noticed like there was something on the license plate, basically, like maybe they were party members. And anyway, certain people had the right to do that and not other people. And like my Chinese hosts were impressed that I was able to say, like to ask them, I'm like, is that what, does this symbol mean that this car is special and they can do whatever they want? So, but essentially that's what it meant.
You know, veterans here also have the say that they can park anywhere they want because they're veteran, you know. Yeah.
Okay, Dominique, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I really like the idea about the parking fees in Madrid. So I want to ask you about like Montreal, because I know in Saskatoon we have several bike lanes in downtown and a lot of time, but they're just like painted bike gutters. So a lot of times there have been people like parking on them and the city did not even like deal with them until 24 hours in downtown neighborhoods and 72 hours in residential areas. So does Montreal enforce this really like quickly?
Not quick enough. And I mean, it's more of an issue in bus lanes, at least in the past. Like they have better, but even it's an issue. It definitely is an issue, and they're working on trying to develop more tools. And I mentioned earlier in the call, maybe you weren't here, but New York recently passed a law that citizens can report cars doing this, and if they like send a photo of the car with a license plate, the citizen actually will get some money for that as well. And the car will get a ticket, and the citizen, so they're basically making it like much more, and the fines are not particularly high yet. Like here in Montreal, for example, blocking a bus lane is very expensive. Like I think it's $350 plus the parking violation. Whereas blocking a bike lane doesn't have that kind of, like that's part of the problem is actually there's no sort of defined fine. Like literally it could be that they cannot ticket you because there's no defined fine. You're just sort of in a gray zone. Like you're not following the rules, but there's no, so this is, at the moment, it's certainly not expensive to block a bike lane.
We don't have like bus lanes in Saskatoon, but we have bus stops, and so many times I've seen cars blocking bus stops, and especially like after the rush hours of like 6 p.m. And that is really troublesome because I called the city once and they said that they will not deal with that until 7 a.m. the next morning. So basically that car would just like park there. The bus drivers can't do anything. And basically like they can just, and then even if they have the fine is a universal fine of $50, no matter what violations you make. So if you park in front of a fire hydrant, if you let your parking expire, if you park in a bus stop, whatever it is, it's still only $50. So it's not enough to enforce drivers.
Right, especially if you're only caught, once in a while.
Yeah. And then this fines, you don't even have to like pay it immediately. Like if you don't pay it, then when you do your property tax at the end of the year, they will like collect that for you. So it's basically like it's not enforced.
Okay, I think that's fairly common in many cities. Rafael, you want to add something?
Right. So I've recently seen a discussion online saying that on-street parking improves the safety for pedestrians by slowing down cars. What's your take on it?
I certainly can appreciate that argument. And I remember many years ago, I lived on a street where we only had parking on one side or the other, and it would alternate. And I suggested to a neighbor that maybe we should allow cars to park on both sides. And my neighbor was a very, I knew someone who I knew, he was very gentle, very rational, normal person. He actually almost became violent. Like he wanted to, he's like, people will come from like this Laval, it's an island like far away. He's like, people will come from Laval to park on our streets. And I'm like, they're gonna drive like 20 cars to park on our street, which is like not even like near downtown. Like it wasn't rational. But and I think today that particular street, they do have parking on both sides, but they also built like a lot of curb extensions. They sort of, reduced the amount of parking. I definitely can appreciate that argument. But it really depends. And I mean, in Montreal, we have a lot of one-way streets with parking on both sides and cycle paths on each direction, like one cycle path. So it's 2 ways for bicycles and 1 way for cars. So I like that. I think that's a fairly good configuration, and it's fairly easy to do as well. So but I mean, in general though, my attitude though is that streets, I mean, a growing need is for having parking spaces for deliveries and other kinds of vehicles. Like this is something we really need to be thinking about much more seriously, because where so many more deliveries are happening, like every block should have dedicated spaces for that. And we don't have that now. Mohammed, you wanted to add something?
I want to ask questions. I mean, maybe 2 questions. I don't know. So, I mean, I want to say, if you remove side parking in a street, what we should do if we remove them? Okay, so we're gonna see some people are neglecting, some people maybe protest, and
You put
so
in a
on.
bike lane.
Okay, yeah, and businesses may ponder that you affected our economic, income. So, and the other question is that, okay, if you're asking people to pay for the parking ticket, something like fee, so where that money should be spent to develop more parking spaces, or what should we do?
Oh, very good questions. I have some thoughts. Would anyone else like to share their thoughts first? First of all, note that we're approaching 11:30, which technically I think was the time Annika wanted to finish this conversation. Right? If you're listening, Annika, let us know what do you want us to do.
So I think if we want to be a little flexible, maybe let it go on for about 15 minutes, but I usually try to stay within the time frame just to keep a routine for roundtables so that people can have expectations about time. But maybe we can also finish up with a theme for another roundtable connected to this one, because it seems like there's a lot to discuss. So we can schedule the next one following off of this.
Okay, I think the next one, it would seem like the paid parking, I think is definitely a theme that's come back many times. In India and in Sri Lanka, do you have paid on-street parking? Does that exist as a concept?
Yeah, in Sri Lanka, definitely we have a lot of paid on-street.
And how about in India?
We do have it
Okay.
in India, but then again, highly registered.
Okay, so yes, and Mohammed, and this is exactly sort of what is so challenging with removing parking is such a hard thing to do, because there are lots of different stakeholders.
I do support it.
Well, and it becomes political. Like, I mean, this is something that frustrates me. Like, you basically have politicians running saying, "I will not remove parking," and the one who, so like you have politicians who say, "I want to build bike lanes," and they're running against someone who will say, "I will protect the parking." And
Yeah, I think as I mentioned earlier, I think we need more cultural actions immediately to educate people that cars as a package brought us more drawbacks than benefits.
we do. I agree. And I mean, I hope that this network will help us find ways to be more proactive.
So let's do it.
It's a challenge. I mean, even in a city like Montreal, which has a long culture of using streets as public space, and like lots of people do walk here, like, and even in neighborhoods that are really well known as, like, I live in what is maybe the most progressive neighborhood in all of Canada. And even here, politicians are afraid to say that they're going to take away parking.
I can understand that.
So, Devanta, yes.
I mean, I personally think we can only discourage parking only after we provide alternatives like public transportation and cycling, or like good walking and all these things. So without providing that, I don't think it's possible to convince people less.
This is what I'm trying to do with my community parking idea, actually. Like, it's really to provide some sort of alternative off streets, so that it'll make it easier for cities to reappropriate streets as public space. Arshad?
I may add something.
Yes.
May I? I
Yes.
mean, as a car owner, for instance, I park my car somewhere and pay the fee. Okay, so and you're going to, and the money that you grow, you're going to invest it on public transportation. I paid for the parking space, and you're going to do that the opposite.
Well, this is a very good point, and that as well, I think, is perhaps would be a good subject for a future roundtable. Like, how do we use the money that is raised? Like, most parking authorities, the money that they raise basically goes to finance their services. Like, it costs a lot of money to hire agents to apply the laws. So the idea is they basically would be self-supporting. Sometimes they generate revenue for the city as well. Like, I know in Montreal, it used to work that the city would pay, the agency would pay the city like $100 million for the right to manage their public parking spaces. So the agency itself was actually not really the city. It was like a what's called a para-public agency. And if they generated more revenue than $100 million per year, then the city would get a certain amount of that, and the agency would get a certain amount. Now, the money that they gave to the city, I don't think the city had any obligation to use that in any particular way. It was like basically just money that was going into the city's budget. And actually, this is a big problem in North America. Cities have very, very few ways of raising their own revenue. Like, they basically have property taxes and parking tickets are essentially, and traffic tickets. Like, those are basically the only sources of revenue that the city has. So the police also, they give a lot of tickets, and unfortunately in Montreal, at least, they often ticket pedestrians for not following the rules. Arshad.
There's so many new things. Okay, it's a cultural shock for me.
I know a lot of places, like, basically pedestrians can do whatever they want and nobody thinks about that. Here in Montreal, there's actually like a policy. They give the same number of tickets to pedestrians as cars, and which is really stupid. And it's very easy to catch pedestrians, and it takes more effort to catch cars, basically.
There's also that jaywalking ticket that
Yeah.
I can't completely don't understand what's the point.
Yes.
Like, it's only $20 in Saskatoon, but
Here it's like a parking
I
ticket,
don't-
or it's like it's actually a traffic offense. It's over $100.
oh my God, that is crazy. I am as a pedestrian, I want to like freely walk. So which is why I'm really objected to this. Like
Yeah,
pedestrians they have the rights to, and then I think in Toronto they also start enforcing, like, so when there's light, the red light flashing hands, you're not allowed to cross the street. And then if you caught, then they also give you $100 ticket or something.
Yeah. Arshad, did you have something to add?
Yeah, firstly, I think that the whole concept of jaywalking is absurd. I have one question, one idea that I'd like to share. First question again is for you, Zvi. I have read about some practices being done, I forgot where, but it was found out that when parking spaces for cars were removed and spaces for cycle parking were allowed in front of shops, the local business got more business from the cycle park, people who cycle. So has something been done in Canada?
I think the research that is most widely known is from US locations like Portland and perhaps a few others. I don't think I'm not familiar with extensive research in Canada, but I'm sure I really hope we're going to be doing this in Montreal, because we have a new, it's called a Express cycling network, which part of it was on a very commercial street, where they removed 2 lanes of traffic, and they still kept the parking on both sides, but they made the street much more narrower, and they completely changed the way the street feels. So I'm sure, like before, there were lots of stores along there, and it is close to the metro stations, but they weren't doing very well. It was like not a very comfortable place to walk, even though there was space, but there was just too many cars. And now it's like really, really changed. Like it's really doing much better, and it's a much more pleasant place to be, just because the car traffic is much less extensive, and you can cross like in mid-block. Like before, you could only cross at the intersections. Like now that you can actually cross in lots of locations, and you probably have to be more careful of cyclists than cars, actually. But I'm sure that this is having a really direct impact on, like, there are new businesses opening up. Like in the past, everything was just closing, whereas now, like, more and more new things are starting to reopen. So I hope that we'll have good numbers about this in the future. I mean, but it's very hard to generalize. Like these things, they really depend on a lot of other factors, and so yeah, you can come up with numbers. But I know in Montreal, like a lot of the perception of, like, they've also found that people who do the shopping, like, mostly come by foot, but the owners think that everyone comes by car. Like it's actually the owner's perception of who their clients are, which is driving this sort of narrative. And often the owner drives themselves because they don't live nearby anymore. Like maybe they did when they opened the store, but they don't anymore. So it's really, it's the owner's personal needs, which are sort of shaping the way that they perceive their clients need things. And so this is, yeah, but it's hard to put a number and then to generalize that to another location or another. It's a challenge.
Yeah, because I think it depends a lot on the land use policy that the state follows. But US cities are much more different than the Indian cities, right? We have much more mixed use policies here than.
Yes, well, this is also where Montreal is different from the rest of Canada as well. Like we have a lot of mixed use here, and like the land use policies here are different from the rest of Canada, actually.
Just one suggestion, idea that's what I want to share with you. Just something that came up to my mind. I think what we can do is like to come up with some studies or come up with some numbers to find out like what the government is actually losing, the amount of revenue that the government is losing by not monetizing parking spaces. If you can come up with that, probably the whole, I don't know.
Well, I mean, Donald Shoup, are you familiar with Donald Shoup, with the high cost of free parking?
Not yet.
He's he's a professor in California. He's retired now, but he spent his entire career basically studying parking. And he wrote a very, very big book. It's like close to 1,000 pages, called The High Cost of Free Parking, where they do try to monetize these costs and understand how much is foregone revenue. I personally, though,
What's his name again?
Donald Shoup. I will put this in the chat. I personally, though, he was less well known when I was doing my research, but I did read a lot of his work back in the days, and I now think that it's actually the allocation of space which is more important than the pricing of parking. So like how we allocate the right of way. Okay, and it's not only charging for it, just like physically giving that space, like allowing cyclists or pedestrians or buses to use that space instead of cars. And particularly parked cars, like you're not even moving. Like streets, like what is the role of the streets? Is it really for only movement? Is it for a place of commerce? Is it a place of interaction? And parked cars in that space, well, they block everything actually. So like yes, the city could monetize that space and perhaps make money from it, but you could use it for other things as well. You could use it to make buses run more smoothly. You could use it for delivery zones for the commerces. You could use it for bicycle parking. Like there's a lot of other things. The opportunity cost of using that space differently is very high. So I think this is something that we should think about. So. Okay.
Yeah, great. Thanks. New perspective for me.
And there's a group called the Choupistas It's on Facebook. If you contact me afterwards, I can probably find the link. So like there's like a Facebook group of people who sort of think about these kind of topics about how we price parking and the high cost of free parking and things like that. So there are many exchanges and they share articles, and then Professor Shoup is still quite active in this area. Like he shares articles and things. Are there any more questions, or should we wrap it up? Okay.
I was hoping to hear some female perspective as well. We have Salma in here for her.
We did have, she's still here. I think she is left. We did have Salma, but she said that she was in a public place and couldn't talk. So I know that she was here listening for a while. I agree. I think this is all of these issues.
If you just give me a minute. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Yeah.
Go
Regarding
ahead.
public transport, regarding public transportation in the state of Delhi, the government has actually decided to give free public transport, make it public transport free for women, because in India, their labor force participation is very, very weak. And that's to encourage the people from specifically women from the lower economic strata, because they need to travel. So, and because of the city being huge and the working places being very far away, the mobility was being hampered. So they started this thing of providing free buses. It was tried in Guwahati also, they tried to replicate it, but then it was a failure. Okay. But then in Delhi, it's going on.
As I'm sure there are gender issues related to parking as well. I can imagine like women perceive, if you have to park far away and walk in a dark space, it would be uncomfortable. Mohammed, you had a question? I think we're going to wind it up in a moment.
Yes.
This might be the last question.
A quick question. Have you ever saw a person fighting with another person for a parking space?
Most definitely, yes.
Okay.
I have seen, and in fact, in the U.S., like they're murder, like people kill each other. Like everyone in the U.S. has guns, and there have definitely been murders about parking places in the U.S.
I see.
And
So
and I think this is something that I find very fascinating, that like people in general, when you drive a car, you are very sensitive to disruptions. People are getting in your way, they're considered an obstacle, and it makes people mad. But the sort of the mechanism for parking is a little bit different, in my opinion. Like parking is more about territorial, like it's my space. So people react in a different way, and they can actually become even more violent than so it's really, yes, but I mean, it's really disturbing, like how people react to these things, and how we can change that. I don't know. Like this is why we're here, I guess.
Cultural work.
Yes. Okay. I think we should wind it up with that. We definitely it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you to everyone who's been participating. I've definitely learned a lot, and I hope you have too. And I think it's, I have lots of questions as well. Like, this is really more about questions and how to explore finding solutions. Like, I don't think anybody knows what the solutions are at this point. Like, I think it's really how can we overcome our auto dependence? That's really where, and in my opinion, or what I see, like when we talk about mobility and things like that, we very often forget about parking. So I personally think that parking is really one of the more crucial elements in how we decide what mode of travel we're going to use. Okay, so Annika, I'll let you close the recording so that you can save it and share it.
Okay. I will stop recording now. Thank you, Zvi.
Thank you. Thanks to all the participants. And maybe, I don't know, we'll see if we can have another one of these in another month.
Okay.
Perhaps a slightly different. Thank you all. So, and maybe we'll try and find another time period to make it easier for people on the West Coast in the US. Like it was, I'm very happy that we had a very more, well, actually, what time is it in Asia? Like in Sri Lanka and And India, what
Sri
time is it
Lanka,
right now?
it's 9:17 p.m.
Okay,
Just same in India.
okay. I'm very happy to that we were able to find a mutually convenient time. So and yeah, and your mobility challenges are insane. Like I know that. Like I know how big cities are in Asia compared to like a Canadian city. Like our problems are so small here. And
also less like focus on sustainable mobility.
for now, but I mean, I think it's you're not gonna like everybody is not gonna have a choice really. Like when as energy becomes more expensive, like it's
But they are
hostels,
here at least they are focusing on like electric vehicles and
but even electricity.
Those kind of things.
Okay, Zvi, I'm gonna stop recording now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks to everyone, and we'll have another conversation another time.